Okay, I think it's time to get started. My name's Mike Niehaus, and I have to say that this is the oddest tech ed session that I've ever been asked to do, because I'm typically talking about deep technology stuff. And from a assessment, compatibility, and planning perspective, we're not talking deep technology stuff for the most part. We're talking more about process, procedures, projects, and trying to do these large-scale chunks of work. So it's not going to be the typical session that I would normally do. It's actually kind of taking a step back to something that we really focused on maybe a decade ago, and we've kind of ignored over the last few years as we focused more on the tools and technologies. So we're trying this out. We'll see how it goes, and hopefully you can let us know if this is valuable or not, and we can continue to work on that. I also kind of look at this room as a personal focus group. So if there are questions, comments, and areas that you think that we should put more effort into, let me know, raise your hand, offer your comments, because what we're trying to figure out is we've put so much emphasis on the deployment tools that's caused us to kind of lose a little bit of focus on the deployment process and the project management and the application tracking and some of the other things that you have to do when you try to take this to a large scale. So let's jump in. First, with just a general premise that for large organizations, deploying a new version of Windows is a lot of work. I'm sure everyone in the room can agree with that. Just to get a feel, how many of you have more than 1,000 devices in your organization? Most of the room. More than 10,000. Okay, shrinking down a little. More than 100,000. Still a fair number of people. At those quantities, anything times 1,000, 10,000, or 100,000 is a lot of work. And, well, we don't like a lot of work. So we're always trying to figure out how can we reduce that amount of effort. So, do you have a plan? Do you have a plan for deploying a new version of Windows that you've been executing every few years? Or is it always brand new? Do you just start from scratch? Most organizations don't have the stability for the people who did the previous Windows deployment to still be around to do the new Windows deployment. So every time it's like starting over. And when you start over, the first challenge really is more getting over the fear, because you have to know where do I even begin to deal with this massive challenge. And the challenge really isn't so much about the new OS. The challenge isn't really even so much about the nuts and bolts of deploying a new OS times 10,000 or 100,000. It's much more about everything else that sits on top of Windows that I have to make sure is going to work. So we'll put a lot of emphasis on assessment and applications and trying to rationalize that, but there is quite a bit more to it. We want to try to alleviate the fears, to give you some level of confidence that once you get started down this path, you can complete it in a reasonable amount of time, and your business will keep running. Because if your business doesn't keep running, you probably no longer work for the business. That's the challenge. It's one thing to say, well, okay, we can deploy all these machines, but then you start looking at the first groups of people and think, well, we should start with IT, and oh, wait a minute, what about the CIO and the CIO's secretary and all these other important people that we first need to get this process to work really well for? So that's kind of the starting point. What we had put together back in probably 2003 was this idea that we can break this whole thing down into a group of feature teams. Now, if you are smaller than 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 seats, all of these teams are probably one person. Not a fun process. Your job is to create an image, deploy an image, package the apps, deploy the apps, set up the infrastructure, do all of this. But for larger organizations, this becomes a team effort, a group of teams working together to achieve a common goal. And this is how we broke that project down in the BDD wheel, as we called it, in 2003. Everything on here is still valid today. I mean, it's just a logical way of breaking apart a project to work toward getting this new operating system deployed. So we've got a variety of feature teams. Those feature teams will do the different pieces and parts. We'll talk about each one of these as we go through, but it is just a natural way of doing an enterprise deployment project. We've talked with many customers who have not even known that this type of content existed. They've built up project teams themselves, and their end result, their end structure was pretty close to the same as what we had laid out. You've got a central project management office, a project manager, a project planner, that type of person who's trying to coordinate all of this. You have a project lead, and then you have all the teams that are working together with them. How many of you have worked with a project management office or a project planner to do these types of projects? I bet you caused them to tear their hair out, because project managers look at this as activities that need to be performed, dependencies between those activities, and there's just a natural flow through these. Then they get into IT and find out that IT doesn't work that way. IT is an iterative process. So if you say the image must be done before the image can be deployed, well, no, that's not really true. We can do 70% of the image and then deploy it. Then we can do another 5% and then deploy it some more. Then we can do a little bit more. So it becomes a challenge for a project manager to track. Most project managers that I've worked with over the years have given up on fancy project management tools and just switched to spreadsheets with task lists where they can check off the items as they're completed, where they can track percentage complete, because that's really more interesting to them than the actual flow of the task through. They really just want to know, are we on schedule, are we not on schedule? So it is a challenging project environment to deal with something that's not quite the traditional task by task by task breakdown. Unfortunately, when we initially did this in BDD, we had that same very rigid, deliverable-based project plan. Here's the project plan that says the image team will deliver an image to the deployment team. The app team will deliver apps to the deployment team. All of these teams have deliverables that they pass to each other. But it neglected the reality of the IT environment. So as a result, most organizations looked at all the 500 pages of documentation that we provided around that and said, this is absurd. This is just way too detailed, too challenging to implement. But we like the team breakdown, so we'll set up the structure that way. We just don't want the volumes of documentation that you're trying to inflict a process on top of this. That's when things started shifting more toward a tool-based approach, and trying to provide more how-to guidance caused that 500 pages to turn into more like 1,500 pages of documentation. At that point, we had to say, well, no one in their right mind is going to read 1,500 pages of documentation to figure out how to deploy Windows in their enterprise. So let's strip it back. Let's get rid of the project management stuff. Let's get rid of all of the feature team documents, and let's focus in on the tooling and the how-tos. So all this stuff kind of got pushed to the side. Our services organization still uses it. If you bring in MCS to help you with a project, they'll work with you to set up a team structure like this. They know what deliverables each team needs to do. They'll work to get that project completed. So it still exists, and most deployment partners will use this structure in order to complete the project. The feature teams themselves, Other than the project management team that's kind of overseeing the whole thing, there's a team that needs to look at infrastructure, a team that looks at image engineering, application management, migration of data, deploying Office, because that generally becomes a good effort in itself, especially with all the Office add-ons and dependencies against Office. Securing the OS and securing the overall environment, that's kind of specialized in its own right. The deployment process, so once you've got the image, you throw it over the wall to another team and say, all right, now please deploy this. Those can be different teams, those can be different processes. Testing can either be done by the individual teams or they can be done centrally. So you could have one team validate all of that. So those are the feature teams that were laid out. Let's just walk through each one of those and kind of get a feel for the types of tasks. Starting with the business case, the project management overall. You're not even going to start this project until a core set of people have decided that the value of Windows 10 outweighs the cost of doing this. So that initial business case building requires analyzing the feature set and saying that there are features in Windows 10 that have value to us, and then analyzing the deployment costs. How much is it going to cost us to put the teams together, to do the work, to remediate the applications, to update the infrastructure, to get us to that new operating system? So we always talk about the features, which we covered in the foundation session on Monday afternoon with Jim Alcove and all the PMs that demoed the features that are in the Windows 10 for Enterprise. But it's a much harder challenge to come up with that other number of what's the total cost of doing this deployment. Unfortunately, for most people, the total cost they're going to use is what it cost them the last time. And the last time was probably Windows XP to Windows 7, which is the worst possible cost because of all the application compatibility issues, all of the upgrades then that needed to be done to get the apps ready, all of the work that went into that. We hope this time around we can reduce the costs, and then when you look at that against the value, you look at Windows 10 and say, yeah, that's looking like a good solution for our enterprises. We've then passed that first business case hurdle. Let's move forward from there. You'll probably see our account teams trying to help you with this all the time because, well, they're trying to get you to deploy the software because software that you own, because you have software assurance or other agreements in place with us that you haven't deployed, doesn't have any value to you. Software that doesn't have any value doesn't make you a happy customer. So they will work with you to try to build this business case. Once you get past that, the first thing typically that you need to do is get your infrastructure ready for Windows 10, because doing infrastructure upgrades can take a while. The typical infrastructure upgrades are on the Windows Server side, System Center, and the management tools that you're using for the client OSs. So for System Center, if you were in my session yesterday, we talked about that. There will be a new service pack for System Center 2012 or 2012 R2. There'll be System Center vNext that will be released. All three of those will support Windows 10, but all three of those require upgrades to your infrastructure. We also talked about activation. If you're using KMS for activation on Windows 7 or Windows 8 or Windows 8.1, well, you'll have to update your KMS servers, apply a hotfix, install new product keys to get ready for that first Windows 10 device that will be dropped into your environment. The change control processes that most of you go through to get these pieces in place, that could take a few months. How many of you have processes that you would say will require at least 6 months to get those types of pieces in place? Usually a fair number. How many of you think you can do that within 2 weeks? I want to go work for those companies. The change control processes that most large organizations have put in, especially when you get outsourcers and other service partners involved, can be very lengthy. So this becomes the first challenge. One of the things that needs to be gotten out of the way before you can really even start with even a small pilot within your IT group. If you drop in a Windows 10 system and it can't be managed and can't do activation, well, then you're kind of stuck on what you can do from that point. Samesh had a session yesterday where he talked about all of these requirements and some of the other things that expand out beyond there, but that becomes kind of the one team that's going off and getting ready for Windows 10. Generally, the next team that's engaged is building an initial image, taking the Windows 10 bits after they're released, sometime this summer, downloading them from the Volume License Service Center. They should be available fairly quickly after RTM, and dropping that in place to build an image. How many of you use MDT to create your image? Half the room. How many of you use Config Manager? That's a good number. So now you're dependent on that infrastructure team in order to get to a point where you can really even build your image. If you're using MDT by itself, standalone, it's a little easier because then you're not upgrading your entire infrastructure. You're updating one machine. And even if you don't want to upgrade your existing MDT, you can just set up another one. Set up a workstation, install MDT 2013 Update 1 on it, add Windows 10 into it, recreate your existing Windows image creation process using the new version. What a lot of companies will do to enable that is take their existing MDT deployment chair, X-copy it to a different place, install the new MDT on top, upgrade that copy of the deployment chair, and then start working with the copy. Because that doesn't disturb your production environment, you can keep going with your Windows 7 environment there, start working with Windows 10 separately. Eventually just make the switch over to the new machine for ongoing maintenance. On the infrastructure side, we've also recognized that we put customers in a bind in the past where we said, you need to upgrade your infrastructure to this version in order to support this new OS. But we would then take away supported operating systems from that new version. So you ended up having to run multiple versions, one for the old one for the new OS. So we've pretty much agreed never to do that again. So we want to make sure we continue to support all the OSs that you still have, which today is pretty much Windows 7 and above. How many of you still have Windows XP systems of any significant quantity that you worry about? Not too many around, but there are still some. And unfortunately, because Windows XP is out of support, we're pretty much removing that from all of our infrastructure products. It just won't work on most of those anymore. But for everything else, even Windows Vista on up, we'll be able to support that as kind of the source to then get to the new target OS. So on MDT 2013 Update 1, we've got some labs set up this week. We thought, well, we don't know how much interest there'll be in hands-on labs on the new version of MDT, the new version of Config Manager, doing OS deployment of Windows 10, doing in-place upgrades. So we scheduled 2 ILL sessions for each of those topics. The room holds about 100 people. So we thought 200 people for each one of those. That's a good number. 1,200 people signed up for each of the labs. Well, that didn't work out very well. But fortunately, we have these all set up as hands-on labs. They're available for you to access remotely. You can try them out, see what the changes are. And we're working then to publish these on the TechNet Evaluation Center so that you can access these online after the event ends too. So we should make those available for you to try out if you couldn't get into the labs that Kyle and Wayne are hosting on that this week. So image engineering, no big changes in the process there. You just need to drop in Windows 10 and customize it the way you see fit. We've been making the case over the years to say you don't need to do a whole lot of customization. Tweaking every little piece of the OS is very counterproductive. It takes a lot of time. You get very little benefit out of it. We would much rather you just deploy the vanilla OS the exact same way people would see it at home and then just layer software on top of that and the latest updates on top of that just to save time. Because if you layered those on as part of the deployment process might take too long. So putting apps in it, okay, you can create a fatter image. Putting language packs, putting updates, putting other things in it, great, you can create a fatter image. But tweaking every little UI element, tweaking every little OS behavior, generally is not a best practice. We've talked with a lot of larger companies that used to do that excessively, and they would spend months of time every time a new OS would come out to try to figure out how to recreate those in the new OS. Can you guess what the number one request from those companies would then be? Uh-oh. So much for that one. We'll grab the batteries and shove that. There's one more under there. But the number one request was, how do I make the new OS look like the old OS? Which was always very counterproductive. It's not possible to make Windows 10 look exactly like Windows XP. It's not possible to make it look exactly like Windows 7. So trying to do that just slows the process down. I mean, most companies will eventually realize that, but it doesn't mean that that question doesn't get asked over and over and over again. Will it work? Yes, it works. So image engineering should be the easy part because it's not drastically changed from Windows 7, Windows 8, or Windows 8.1. You do need new tools to do it just because there have been changes to the underlying tools that are used as part of this. The biggest catch will probably be changes related to the start screen layout, the start menu layout. If you're used to doing that with Windows 7 where you set up items in the all users menu, the process of doing that in Windows 10 and 8.1 for that matter is different. So there will be some tweaks necessary for that. Otherwise, image engineering, straightforward, build the golden image. I've talked to a few people this week that then try to use that image in their existing environment. So they just drop it in and all the existing group policies get applied to it, and then nothing works anymore. So that's another topic that Samesh touched on in his session, that you need to be careful of, you need to look at what your group policies are actually doing, and there are some things that they may do that are bad, like applying security policies, applying an INF that contains security settings that alters the Windows file system security to change the permissions on, say, the root of the C drive, the program files folder, the Windows folder. Doing those types of tweaks can be problematic. It has a tendency to break all of the Windows apps running on the system. So if you have your image and it works great, and as soon as you connect it and join your domain and it doesn't anymore, look at your group policies, figure out what you're actually applying.
Hi. We are running prototypes, let's say, using the security baseline for Windows 8.
Right?
That is working fairly well, though we don't do any changes to the files.
Right. Yeah, so the security baselines that were published for Windows 8.1 are fairly lightweight. I mean, they're tweaking the OS security behaviors to get rid of some of the legacy stuff that's no longer considered secure, like passing a clear text password to a LAN-man server, which could be a Trojan and steals your password and runs off with it. But those types of settings make perfect sense. It's some of the past guidance where it said, oh, and you also want to change the ACLs in these 27 different files and folders. That's dangerous. You need to reevaluate those for the new OS just to make sure that they don't break anything. We assume that the OS is going to be secure by default for a consumer, and maybe you need a little bit more tweaking to make it secure for an enterprise. But we're pretty close. There's not much of a delta between those two. If it's secure enough for a consumer, it's fairly close to an enterprise as well. The deployment process then is taking the image and pushing it out to those tens of thousands of machines. The big emphasis that we put on this over the past decade is to make this dynamic and flexible. We've run into too many organizations where the deployment team spends 6 months, I think is the worst case that I've ever heard, just defining profiles of applications. We're going to figure out for every person in the company what applications they need and define a profile. We're going to then do deployments and target specific profiles to specific machines based on what the person does. If you have a 100,000 person organization, you're probably going to end up with thousands of profiles. It's just not workable. Assume that every person is different and every machine needs to have different software put on it based on what it's using today, and build your deployment process to do that. If you're doing the traditional wipe and load, where you have to reinstall all the applications as part of the process. If you're going to do an in-place upgrade, which is what we're suggesting for Windows 10, all the existing apps stay. If all the existing apps stay, well, then you're just needing to focus on testing them to make sure that they work. But making a dynamic process is key for deployment so that you can handle any models of machine that are thrown at it, any application configurations that go at it. Trying to get smarter than that and having IT somehow decide what applications end users are supposed to run is not productive. The people that are truly the experts in what apps they need to do their job are the people doing the job, not the IT people. If IT tries to dictate that, IT tends to get outsourced because they're getting in the way. They can help. They can certainly encourage organizations to look at their application portfolio, which is something we'll talk about later, but they can't dictate. They can try, but I've seen way too many organizations that have been outsourced as a result. So people like Michael Nystrom, Johan Arwidmark, and plenty of others have kind of made a living of having sessions where they talk about deploying dynamically, being able to adjust the deployment process to make it very flexible, to put things back the way they need to be. That becomes one effort. Identifying the drivers that are needed for each of the devices, that becomes another effort. That second effort sometimes is done by a different team. We have seen organizations that have split off a team whose sole job is to test every piece of supported hardware, to identify the drivers that are necessary, and then provide those to the deployment team saying, here are the drivers I want for this model, here are the drivers I want for this model, and so on for every model that they support. So it is possible to divide that effort. In-place upgrade, that's certainly going to simplify things to go to Windows 10. You have to trust it, as we talked yesterday afternoon. So we'd encourage you to try it out. Try out the labs, get a feel for how that process works, and find some machines inside your organization to attempt this. How many of you have more than one PC? Yeah, we're IT people. Of course we have more than one PC. How many have more than 5? That's frightening as well. But if you've got multiple machines, you can sacrifice one of them and try out this process. Do an automated in-place upgrade. Use an MDT or config manager task sequence. Upgrade it to Windows 10. Take the oldest, crappiest Windows 7 install, upgrade it to Windows 10, and see how it works. If that looks okay, expand your pilot to the person next to you, the IT department, and then out from there. So you won't really have a good level of comfort for in-place upgrade until you try it on a sampling of PCs to make sure that it's as reliable as we say it is, as quick as we say it is, and as easy as we say it is, and that every application actually works after the process completes. The big test really isn't do the apps work after the upgrade. The big test is do the apps work the same after an in-place upgrade versus a clean install and a reinstallation of the app? The answer should be yes. The underlying systems aren't that different. So if you find instances where that's not the case, let us know, provide feedback, because we're doing our best to make sure that that's not going to be the case. On the Office side, how many of you do an Office upgrade at the same time you deploy a new OS? A fair number. So that it generally is an effort split off onto a team of its own. Installing and configuring Office by itself isn't a big deal, but all of the things that hook into Office, those are a big deal. All the add-ins, all the third-party apps that use different Office components first need to be identified, and there are tools to help with that. And once they've been identified, they need to be tested with the new version of Office and maybe upgraded if there were significant changes between the versions. So there are plenty of discussions with consultants around how to do that. Curtis had a session to talk about how to make that deployment project successful. Think of that as kind of a whole sub-project within your Windows project to get you to Office 365 Pro Plus or some other current version of Office at the same time. That can kind of snowball. We've seen organizations that say, well, I'm going to upgrade to the new OS, I'm going to upgrade to Office, and, well, while we're at it, let's upgrade every other outdated piece of software that we have too. And it continues to add more and more time and cost to the project, to the point where they're then saying, oh, our deployment project is going to take 5 years and cost us $100 million. Well, yes, but look at all of the neglected items that you're taking care of at the same time. If you don't neglect them so much, then you don't run into that. So it's a tricky trade-off that you can do some, but if you let this take over the project and become a focus of the project becomes just way too big to manage. On the operations side, getting everyone else in the organization, everyone who's outside of the project, ready to handle the new OS is a good exercise, and one that we almost never do. I mean, we pretty much deploy it and say, all right, help desk, expect a few extra calls, have a nice day. They need trained. The desk side support people need trained, they need experience, they need to gain familiarity with it. All of those are operational readiness tasks. All of those need to be considered at the same time. We do have Robert Van Winkle from Microsoft IT. They've been going through that for the last almost a year now. So they are talking about their experiences, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well. So you can definitely check out his session to get a better feel for what they're doing to help with that. That brings us to application management, which is a team that historically has been undersized and underappreciated. In order to make sure that applications work on Windows 10, you first need to know what applications you have. And there are multiple types to worry about. Desktop apps, if you're running Windows 8 or 8.1, the modern Windows apps, and web apps or web pages. How many of you have a good idea of what desktop apps are being used in your organization? And you actively manage that list all the time. Not a huge number. We would consider that a best practice. Having an application management team, an application lifecycle team that worries about applications that are being introduced in the environment to make sure that the apps continue to be maintained, that someone's responsible for them, and that they don't continue to just take on a life of their own. If an application can come in anytime and never leave, every application you add into the environment adds cost. It might be small incremental costs, but you multiply that by tens of thousands and it's a burden. For those of you who said you had somewhere around 10,000 machines, how many apps do you think you have? 3,000? 4,000? Who here thinks they have more than 1,000 applications in their environment? More than 5,000? More than 10,000? There's a couple more than 10,000. Generally what we've seen is to get up to that 10,000 number, you're probably close to a 100,000 seat organization. To get above 5,000, you're probably in the 30 to 40,000 seat range. To get above 3,000, you need 10,000 seats. The numbers continue to grow, but there are exceptions to every rule. We've seen organizations with 1,000 seats where they said, we have 5,000 applications. Like, how can you possibly have that number of applications for that number of people? But they do, because they just don't manage it at all. They then do an inventory using various inventory tools, and it comes back with a list of 5,000, so they say, the inventory tool must be right. We have all of these apps. Of course, when they actually dig into it and look at the real number, it's really not 5,000. It's really something smaller. They need to get rid of duplicates and other garbage from that list, which is part of that active management that we really want all organizations to do. So desktop apps, okay, they can come up with that number. You can manage that list. We hope that you're actively managing that all the time, that you have people whose full-time job is to do nothing but that. But there are too many organizations that don't do this at all until it's time to deploy a new OS, and then it's like they're starting over again. So many organizations put together a team for Y2K to inventory all the applications. They built out this complete list. They validated all of them to make sure they would work in the year 2000. And then they threw it all away and never looked at it again. When it came time to deploy Windows 7, they went through the exact same exercise again. Let's identify all the applications. Let's test them all out to make sure they work on Windows 7. Looks good, let's deploy. Now they throw it all away. So every few years when they deploy a new version of the OS, they have to start from scratch. You never want to start from scratch. You want to maintain the list of supported, managed apps inside of your organization. Continue to work with the end users to shrink that number as much as possible, just so that you can get to a reasonable level of apps to support. When you get to web apps then, that becomes even more challenging. How many of you think you have a good inventory of the internal web apps that are being used? That's not even 25% of the room. How many of you think you know what external websites are important to the company? A very small number as well. So very little information available about the web apps that are being used. So if you don't know about it, how are you going to validate it? Just dump it out there and wait for them to call if there are problems? So that's another challenge. That goes back to the initial comment. There's a lot of fear in organizations, a fear of what they don't know, a fear of what could break that they'll find out about later. So having this application management process is really a key thing that most organizations should implement. There's a lot more to that than just inventory. First, you need the list, and there are plenty of tools to help with that. Then you need to rationalize that list, getting rid of duplicate versions, getting rid of hardware support tools, getting rid of all the other little garbage that you don't care about. Then you need to prioritize it, because there are some things that are worth testing, there are some things that aren't worth looking at. If it's mission critical, if the company will lose millions of dollars if this application doesn't work tomorrow, that's critical. You need to test it. If the application will cause the secretary to not be able to print a calendar tomorrow, I don't care. If it breaks, they can call the help desk, we can look at it, we can try to fix it, we can work on that as kind of a reactive approach rather than actively trying to test all of those apps. So a lot of work can go into prioritization and also figuring out who's the true expert in that application. Because the true expert isn't the IT person. The true expert is the person who uses the app every day. IT can test it so far. You can do sanity testing on an application even if you know nothing about it. Launch it, sign in, try to open a document, try to print. All right, looks good. But you don't use all the functionality of the application. The end user does. So When you get to the more important applications, you need to work with the people who actually use it to build test plans to validate it. Maybe you can then repeat that test plan based on what they've told you, or maybe they can do it themselves to do more distributed testing. But that's an effort that requires even just figuring out who the experts are can be a big deal. So you do the validation, you do the sanity test, the smoke tests. For ones that are important enough, user acceptance testing takes that back to the user to make sure that they will sign off and say, yep, the app looks good, I'm ready to go. And in cases where things don't work, well, then you had to have remediation plans. Can I shim it? Can I upgrade it? Can I replace it? What are my plans? How can I do that? Chris Jackson, one of the MCS consultants, the App Compat guy, has done some blogs talking about this over the years. Going back to 2009 and an article that was posted in TechNet magazine when that still existed, he talked about how to plan this part of the project, and then later talked about how to categorize applications. So the first part, inventory, we have tools to do this. We have the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit, which is a simple install. You put it on a machine, you open up the WMI firewall ports, you give it an ID and password so that it can connect remotely to these machines, and you tell it, go inventory. It gets a list of machines from Active Directory or other sources, reaches out, pulls all that back into a central place, and will put it in a database and throw it into a spreadsheet for you. That's all right. It works well in domain environments where all the machines are controlled via group policy. All of them have the ability to have a common administrator account that you can use to talk to them, and GPOs where you can open up the firewall ports. The other tool then, the App Compat Toolkit, is a little different in that it builds a collector, which is kind of a lightweight agent. You build this executable, you find a way to push that executable out to the machine. It runs a process on the machine to collect information about what's on the machine, takes the results, copies it back to a file share. The file share then has a process that picks it up, stores it in a database, and you can run reports against it. That's good, but both of these really are one-time tools. They're designed to be used to gather your inventory. They're not really designed for ongoing maintenance of that inventory. Sure, you can run the scan tools, you can run the inventory process over and over and over again, but it's really the map tools designed more to create that initial report and proposal, so it's very partner targeted. The ACT tool is more about figuring out if you have no idea what's in your environment and you have no other inventory tool, this will tell you. So it's better to have a durable inventory source, which is where Configuration Manager comes in. Configuration Manager can gather inventory from your machines. It does it all the time. And it grabs it in more than one way, because there's not always one best way. Add and remove program entries is one way to do it. Config Manager will grab that as part of the hardware inventory. Asset intelligence tries to use more heuristics to grab information. Software inventory, I really consider useless, because it's a giant list of executable files that you can't map to an application. So don't even try. Focus on the other areas. Modern, well-behaved applications register themselves with add remove programs. That's probably a good enough list to start from. You'll find exceptions here and there, but whatever tool you use, it's probably going to miss some things and you're going to have to manually add them anyway. So get Config Manager set up, have it collect that inventory. Remember how few of us knew what websites were being used, though. That's where the new Enterprise Site Discovery Toolkit comes in. It allows you to take information from IE and collect it. So you can set it up to write the list of URLs that have been accessed from a particular browser into WMI on the computer, and then you can tell Config Manager, collect that for me, and report against it using the Config Manager reporting tools. So that gives you some visibility into the web apps that are being used so that you know what's important, what's accessed frequently, you know where to focus your efforts. That's a new tool. The biggest concern with that tool is, do you really want to know what web pages your end users are going to? Internally, yes. Tell me exactly what internal websites they're going to. Externally, maybe. I don't want to know what some sites are that people might be visiting. There's some information that really isn't safe for my eyes. I don't want to see that. So you can put some controls on this. There are group policy settings to say what I want to control, what domains I want to gather. Do I want to do it only for certain internet zones? So you do get some control over that, but at least it gives you the ability to collect some inventory for the websites that are being used. We've seen other organizations that do this using proxy servers. If all your internet traffic goes through a proxy, your proxy logs are a pretty good indication of what websites are being used externally, but not internally. So maybe you could use this internally and use the proxy server just to give you some information about external site usage. It is shocking the number of people who don't know that their company's using a proxy server and that the company knows all the traffic that's going through it. It's probably authenticated, so they even know who is sending that traffic through it. But I think most companies just don't want to ever look at that. They don't want to know what's going through their internet connection. So those are the tools that are out there. We should probably take a quick look at those just to understand what those tools are. So the question was, can you import the SCCM database into ACT? No, you can't, but they share a common key. So the ACT collector will grab the config manager client unique ID, and the SCCM database, of course, has the config manager unique ID. So what people typically do is use that as the join point to create reports that cross both sets of data. So that can be done, but you basically have two sets of application data that are very hard to merge. So trying to merge the application lists is not an easy exercise because they use different mechanisms to identify the apps. So inventory tool-wise, the AppCompat toolkit is present in the ADK. It hasn't been updated for Windows 10. It probably won't be updated for Windows 10 unless it's broken. Maybe we'll put some fixes in for that. But the basic functionality that exists in the version that was released with Windows 8 and Windows 8.1 is the same today. So we have the Compatibility Manager, which is the first tool to use to create a data collection package. In this case, I created one called Ignite, but we can create another one just by double-clicking, saying that we want an inventory collection package. We can give it a name. We tell it where the client should drop their logs to. Basically, the results of the inventory get dropped into a file share. There's a service running that picks that up and puts it into a database. When we say create, it asks us to save an MSI file. So it'll create a demo.msi. That is the entire collector package. You can push that out using Config Manager. You can push that out using group policy. You can do it via startup script. You can do it in lots of different ways. You could even email it to someone and say, run this executable. But the end result is a log file copied to a file share that imports the data into a database. Then you can use the analyze feature in here just to show you the list of what's available. So it's fairly easy to set up and easy to run against an entire organization. It will pull a lot of data into a file share, so make sure you have enough disk space, and it'll then import it all into a database, so make sure you've got enough space for that. But it's not going to impact the machines very heavily, and the machine that's processing the logs will probably back up when you first turn this on, as hundreds and thousands of these show up, but it'll just continue to chunk away at it until it catches up and processes all the logs. So that one's not too hard to set up. The next one then, the Microsoft Assessment and Planning tool. is architected differently. It doesn't use an agent. It's all remote reach out to the device. So you install that and create a database. And then you can tell it you want to collect inventory data. When I do that, I can specify what devices. So I can specify Windows computers. Where to get a list? Well, just scan my Active Directory domain and give me a complete list from there. It wants to know what domain and what account to use to connect to that. And everything is fine in my domain because it's not very big. Then because it's remotely connecting to the machines, it wants to know what account to use that has admin rights to all those machines to make that remote connection. So in this case, I can use my same domain administrator account. And I can start the collection process, which will use WMI with that credential, and collect inventory. So it basically starts up a whole bunch of threads reaching out across the network. If you're going to do this on a very large organization, tell your networking guys first. They will freak out when they see this because it will be so many connections going out at one time from this one point, they'll think that there's something infecting their network. So ask them first. It's a fairly quick process, gathering that inventory, pulling it back into the central database. It does need to make, the machine has to be online, so it will time out when it tries to connect to machines that aren't. So you can keep running it repeatedly to try to get the machines that aren't currently online. It could error out on some machines that it just doesn't have access to based on the accounts that you were given. And it does have some specific firewall exceptions that need to be configured to make those remote WMI connections and registry connections to the device. Sure. What kind of database? It installs its own SQL. I've lost track of the names. It used to be called SQL Compact, but it's now it's basically a standalone SQL database that runs within the process that is being executed here. So it's very lightweight. You can configure it to use your own SQL server, but there are some extra steps required if you want to do that. So it's designed just to be easy to install and get up and running. So it collects that inventory, and then once it's collected that, you can see the end results. The easiest way is to just tell it to put all that in a spreadsheet. It generates a spreadsheet, which you can see the latest one here. Double click it to open it up in Excel. It can show you information on machine readiness, app discovery, device details, all kinds of information that's collected there. So I can see I had 2 machines that are running Skype. I've got one running the Config Manager Toolkit. So my environment's not very big. It's got a few apps in there. And for the most part, you can go through this then and try to prioritize that. So that becomes the next exercise of taking whatever inventory you're using and reconciling that. Now the Config Manager case, most of you probably already have that turned on because, well, it's easy to do and it doesn't require a whole lot of customization. So in order to enable that, you just go into administration, you turn on the hardware inventory agent, and then you can configure in the client settings what you want to inventory. By default, the hardware inventory collects the add and remove program details. But one of the other things that you'll see in here, if we scroll down, let's see where are the applications? I always forget what they're called in here. Yeah, I think you're right. I think I just scrolled right past it, didn't I? Yeah, installed applications. So it's reading those from WMI, which is actually pointing to the registry keys for add remove programs. So just by having those on, which are on by default, it'll collect information on the apps that are installed. Now you can see right above that, maybe, that there are some additional classes here, like IE count info, IE system info, IE URL info. This is because I've integrated the enterprise I'm drawing a blank on the name, the IE collector thing to put the information on the websites that are being accessed into WMI on the client, and then I can tell Config Manager, please collect that. So I just need to turn on that particular class after I've enabled this. So that was one of the steps. I needed to put that into Config Manager. Another step was that I needed to enable a new group policy setting that tells IE to put that into WMI. So if we edit the group policy here, we can go under Policies, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Internet Explorer. And the policy in question is the only one I have enabled here. Turn on Site Discovery WMI output. So that causes IE to start writing all of this information to WMI. And it describes it. It also talks about how to limit the output by domain or limit the output by zone if you want to filter that. So you can check that out to customize the behavior. So that's the policy. That's one piece. There is a PowerShell script that gets run on each client to enable the feature initially. So you have to push that out, which can be done via software distribution. If we look at this on the client machine, we can actually see the data in WMI. So if we connect to root SymV2 IE telemetry, enumerate the classes, we can see those same classes that we were looking at in Config Manager, like IE URL info. And just to show you that it's collecting this near real time, we can look at the instances here. We see 3 for MSN, Bing, and Azure. If we go to, I don't know, ignite.microsoft.com, loads the page. We enumerate the instances. Now there's a new instance there for Ignite. So it's collecting this. It all sits locally on the client, and then the Config Manager inventory picks that up. When the Config Manager inventory picks that up, it passes it back along to the server so that we could then look at it in Config Manager, in Assets and Compliance, Devices. We can find the device in question, which is Client 71. Look at the Resource Explorer and see that that information's been collected. So collecting it's one thing, then they also provide some sample reports to show you kind of the summarized view of that, but obviously it's not showing the new entry yet because it hasn't run a new inventory, but the last time it ran the inventory, it collected the other 3 websites that I had collected. So all of that's being pulled together in a database, and once it's in that database, you can do whatever you want with it. So it's a useful tool to extend your Config Manager inventory to include much more web data.
Is there any intention of offering the same map via package and having do the same thing? So
We've had that conversation before. The question was, well, what about map? Is there a way that we can feed the map data into, say, a Config Manager database? And the map team was reluctant because the main focus for the map tool was more on the partner who wanted to walk into a customer and be able to grab the inventory and then create a proposal. For the customer themselves, they didn't see a whole lot of value of tying that into the Config Manager database. We said, well, run the map process and just store the data directly in Config Manager. No, they're not really interested in that. So we've had the conversations, but so far, they've been focused on data center scenarios more recently than the client scenarios.
even if they just do the same with the map, push out the package and then they're obviously file share.
Yeah, which has been another architectural debate with them. They say, oh, our biggest advantage is the fact that we're agentless. Well, yes, but there are times when a lightweight agent really works well. So, yeah, it's a good debate to have with them, but so far it's been a rather unproductive one. Yes?
The other way to collect inventory of the application, but also when was the last time the application was executed?
Yeah, and that's a piece that's not really gathered by the tools today. And there is actually, that information is captured by Windows, and that information is available to the telemetry that's being sent back to Microsoft by the Windows 10 preview. It will gather information about the apps and the usage of those apps. And what we're looking at and what we're actually working with some customers on is being able to use that information yourself. So we have the tools built into the OS on Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 8.1, and Windows 10 to gather that inventory. We can then use that maybe to feed Config Manager or maybe a separate database so that you could report on that. But right now that information is not exposed. We do see that as part of the compatibility checks that are run by setup when it goes to upgrade a machine. Same basic engines used by setup as well as this pre-assessment process that has been pushed out to all the Windows 7 and above machines. So we have the data. Right now it's just written to an XML file, but we're working with a group of about 10 customers right now to try to make something useful out of that. So we run a process on every machine. It outputs an XML file. We gather all the XML files together, which is something Config Manager is pretty good at. We upload them all, process them into a database, and then report against it. Well, that's great for 10 customers. That doesn't work for 10,000 customers. So we're trying to figure out for the next version if that's a useful tool to provide to customers directly or maybe via a cloud service. So maybe we just feed all that information to the cloud along with some type of organization identifier and then give you the ability to report against that yourself. So we're still contemplating what to do with that type of data. It's not exposed currently, but for the future, it's something that we want to be able to enable. So let's say you've used one of those tools and you have a list, or you have manually built a list, or you constantly maintain a list. It's more a question then of how do I go about doing this? How do I then rationalize this list? So we want to be able to separate the list into multiple parts. The apps that we actively manage, which are fully supported IT apps that will take care of updating and patching and all that good stuff. There are then IT supported applications, so you call the help desk and they'll help you with them. And then there's unsupported applications that we don't care about. If iTunes breaks on a machine, I probably don't care. And then there are banned applications. Like if they're installing BitTorrent on a machine, you probably don't want that. So you can put in app locker rules or other things to actively block those applications from being installed. So that's the first exercise. After getting rid of the duplicates, after getting rid of the hardware utilities, after all of that stuff. After you've done that, you can then prioritize within each of those categories. Platinum applications, the most important ones that are critical to the organization, that they drive the business, they can never fail. Test them extensively. We can tell you that they work. You won't believe us. You'll have to find that out for yourself because you're not willing to take that risk. Gold apps, yeah, they're probably worth doing a fair amount of testing, but maybe not a fully extensive, well-documented test plan. Maybe they're just going to be run through a few of the key functions to make sure that they work. For silver ones, maybe it's just a sanity test, a smoke test. Does it install? Does it launch? Does it print? If that works, all right, that's good enough. For bronze ones, I don't care. The app's going to be on the machines. If it has an issue after the machine's been upgraded to Windows 10 or after you've deployed Windows 10, they call the help desk, we'll send someone to help. We'll just react to any issues that come up, because the cost of testing that application is too high. We don't want to spend the time testing the application to figure what's the likelihood of it failing. We'll just take the hit if it does fail and worry about that cost later. So the validation process then, You install it, you launch it, you go through some key activities. If you run into any issues, you try to remediate those. Once you've completed that process, the app's ready to deploy. Basically, you're maintaining a list and trying to keep track of the status of all of these. The remediation's the hard part. How do you remediate an application? There are plenty of options. Simplest one, get rid of it. If it doesn't work, throw it away. I wish we could get away with that. There are plenty of applications where you can get away with that if you can offer them a better alternative, but not all the time. Shimming it. You can apply app compatibility shims. We ship a compatibility manager where you can define your own shims that basically cause the application behavior to change. They cause the OS behavior to change so that the app can run on a newer OS. That's a bit of an art form. You have to be particularly good at figuring out, based on the failure that I'm seeing, or what I'm seeing in Procmon or Regmon or some other monitoring tool, here are the types of shims that I need to apply to make this application work. If you bring in the app compat guy and tell him to fix it, oh yeah, he'll whip through these pretty quickly. If you try to figure that out yourself, you might manage to do 1 the first week. You might manage to do 3 the second week. You might get good at it after the first month. So it's definitely a learning curve to figure out, based on the issues I'm seeing, how do I remediate those? There are some options too to virtualize it. They don't solve every problem though. AppV is great for getting applications to not interfere with each other. It's not great for getting the application to work with a new OS. If the app's broken because of the OS, AppV is not going to fix it. But you could use remote desktop to a server 2008 R2 machine, which behaves like Windows 7. You could use virtual machines running Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 8.1. An okay option for apps that aren't used very much, an okay option for apps that don't have any hardware dependencies or any drivers that they require. So it is possible. So you'll have to go through each of the issues as you run into them and figure out what to do about them. On the remediation side, there was just one thing that I wanted to show because it's entertaining. We have this compatibility manager in the App Compat toolkit. That compatibility manager is what you use to create a shim. So if I search here for compatibility, compatibility administrator, and I try to launch it, the compatibility administrator is broken. Like, how are we supposed to fix applications if the tool to fix the applications itself needs a fix? That's just an issue in the current ADK. We acknowledge it's a bug, that we need to address the bug. We'll get that fixed in the new ADK. So if you try this and find out it doesn't work, just install the old version from the ADK from Windows 8.1 and use that instead. So the Windows 10 version is currently broken. So there are then some other teams. The application management one is key, the deployment one, the imaging one, those are all key teams. The security team used to be a big deal, not as much anymore since Windows pretty much ships pre-configured for enterprises. There are some security baseline settings that you want to layer on top of that. We don't recommend extensive customization of the security of the OS because it has a tendency of breaking things. The migration team used to figure out, how do I migrate settings for all these different applications? Not a big deal anymore because, well, USMT added the ability to automatically identify documents by looking at file associations, and it migrates all of those. For most people, that's enough. I just want my data. I don't really care about the settings. There may be exceptions to that. There may be some apps that are configured with certain database connection strings or web server names or something like that. So you may need to define some specific rules to migrate those specific pieces of data, but most organizations never customize USMT at all. They just use it out of the box. It grabs all their data. They're happy. So maybe this team doesn't even exist for some organizations. What we're hoping for longer term is to eliminate the data migration problem altogether by having the app settings roam automatically. We can do that for modern apps today to a Microsoft account. With Windows 10 in the future, we'll be able to do this with Azure Active Directory accounts to have it sync automatically to the cloud. We have a component of MDOP called User Experience Virtualization, or UEV, that can do that for desktop apps to a file server. So when the file changes a registry entry or writes to a configuration file, that's captured, written to a server. And then if you use that app on another machine, it copies it back down and you get the same settings on another machine. So very easy to set up, very easy to implement. For data then, we've got all of these data synchronization tools, all of these cloud storage options, using OneDrive for Business, all of those third-party products that do the same thing. That's what most of us are probably using today already, especially if you've got the 5 to 10 machines, because you want your docs to be available on all the machines that you use. So you dump your docs into that and they automatically sync to each machine. Work folders was added in Server 2012 R2 and is supported on Windows 8.1. It's kind of the file server-based version of OneDrive. I want to automatically sync from my machine to a file server, but it's not particularly flexible for group type activities. It's only for personal documents that want to be synced back and forth. Folder redirection then is at the bare minimum something that you would want to consider. How many of you are using roaming profiles today? Talk to me afterwards. I want to talk you out of it. Roaming profiles are a pain in the rear, but having folder redirection and getting your data at least to sync to a file share, that's okay. It's the registry part that doesn't work particularly well. So those are some of the teams there. There may be others. Like I mentioned before, you can have a hardware team that's certifying models. You can have a peripherals team that tests out printers and monitors and scanners and all types of other special devices to make sure that they work. But you just break this project down into different pieces to figure out what to do. So as far as just a general call to action, make sure you're managing your application portfolio in some way, that you know what you have, that you know what the priorities are, and that you can test those. Consider bringing in MCS, otherwise they'll help you set that up. They'll help you form the project. Get ready for Windows 10, sign up for the Insider program, deploy config managers, latest releases, MDT, and any of these inventory tools that you may need. So with that, one final reminder, Windows 7 support ends in 1,714 days. That is less than 5 years away. When we started talking about XP end of life, everyone laughed and said, oh, no problem, we'll get off of Windows XP before its end of life. And even 2 and 3 years before the end of life, we were saying, hey, you better watch out, it's less than 1,000 days away, you need to get to Windows 7. And it would still caused a problem. So we're starting early this time. You only have about, well, just under 5 years of support for Windows 7 left. If the last OS migration took you more than 5 years, you better start now because you're running out of time. Hopefully the next time around you can get this done in a year or so. So hopefully this one's going to be better. Thanks a lot. If there are any other questions, find me up front. Hopefully that was somewhat useful, but yeah, it's a little different topic.